Hi, I'm Linsi, and today I'll be presenting mostly my graduation project from TU Delft called Composite Countryside. I'm actually from here, I'm from Tallinn, and I started my studies in the Estonian Academy of Arts in the architecture department in 2009. I left in 2012 to do a semester in the United States in Rhode Island School of Design, where I studied illustration and architecture as a joint program. I then went to Holland, where I worked, and started my master's program. I graduated from there in 2015, and since then I've moved to London, where I'm now working for an architecture office called East Architecture, Landscape, Urban Design Limited, an office that is mostly dealing with public realm. And then on the side, me and my partner, Raul, we're working on small projects that I will also be talking about a little bit. So first of all, maybe as a bit of context, and maybe interestingly enough for the students here, in Delft, they don't have a separate interior architecture department. Delft is a big architecture school. There's a lot of studios, some of them focusing on specific building technology, others focusing on technology. And then some, for instance, when I entered, there was a studio that was called the Architecture of the Interior, which maybe is not necessarily what the interior department does here in Estonia, I'm sorry. But there is a certain scale to what the studio focuses on, and that we, I think, largely know as the scale of interior. So they emphasize the importance of the architecture of the detail. They encourage the kind of people looking into materiality, and all in all, there's just a large focus in designing spaces. Sorry. So maybe some of the references. This is a building that I was lucky enough to visit last week in Venice, designed by Carlo Scarpa, or more the renovation of it is designed by Carlo Scarpa. And you can see here the scale of how this architect, I think, has approached the interior with a very specific choice of materials, but also a very specific way of dealing with the context. I don't have a laser, but I will jump in front of here a bit. So you can see classically to Venice, there's a canal here that sometimes enters the building. So on high tide, during high tide, the interior and the gallery there behind it is protected from the water, because the water enters the bottom part of that room. And you can see the same kind of attention also on the outside of the building. So it's not only in the interior, but the same level of detail also appears in the outside spaces, for instance, in the garden. Another Belgian example that I quite like is Architect and de Wilde Winktailleux. And in a way, they're dealing with very normal materials, and with this great focus on the materiality, they sometimes almost dismantle the character of those materials and manage to kind of push them forward, I'd say. Or then another Belgian office, Bovenbouw, who has taken who has used a similar approach on the facade of this building. And then also the office that I'm currently working for, East, who, as I said, is mostly designing for the public realm. But also there, then, you can see this focus or the way that they find it very important to design it to the detail. So it's a project of a high street. So obviously there is a lot of importance on the very normal choice of materials for the pavement. It's London that we're talking about, so there's a lot of people passing by. But then also the design is taken to a level of detail. So all of this I find it has something to do with interiors or what we think of as interiors. So now jumping back to Estonia and my graduation project, we're looking at a small outtake from Google Maps. It's a place in the south of Estonia, and I often get the question of why I needed to study abroad to then graduate with a project that's located in Estonia, and if it's not maybe even stupid that I went there to do a project in Estonia with teachers who don't know much about our contexts, but then maybe that's one of the reasons why I was invited for this symposium, and that was the stranger's perspective that I suddenly in a way acquired. So we're really looking at the deep countryside, let's say, and I quite like this aerial view because it shows the dispersed ways the villages are located on the Estonian countryside, where you can't really see the pattern, but there's just random names popping up in the greenery. So my initial, my fascination is with those landscapes that you can find there, and how easy it is for an outsider to see them as an outsider, also then considering myself as an outsider, how easy it is to see them just as beautiful vistas. But even with working with a photo, you can actually start noticing how much of it is constructed. And it's not only in the fields, it's not only the fields that are the constructed environment, it's also in the birch grove behind the homestead, which is the birch being a traditional tree or traditional species that's associated with the hearth. You can always find the birch grove near homesteads, but also just the vista that you appreciate with the different greens. This is a direct outcome of different crops and being grown on those lands. So there's a strange compositeness in the informal impact that the residents have, and then in the political or formal impact that the state or the local government has. So for instance, the electricity line is something that I consider formal, whereas the birch grove is then very informal. So my fascination was really in the informal and the smartness of some of those extraordinary design decisions, or I think maybe it's wrong to call them design decisions because they're just it's people reacting it's people reacting to their current situation. So in a way, it speaks very much about what they need at this very moment. So you can see this peculiar foundation, or a foundation that seems peculiar to an architect, which is just compiled of big stones and then a piece of plastic that separates the log building from the stone. Or you can see those piles of timber that actually speak about the timber industry that's happening somewhere within the forests, where the material that was worthwhile was taken away already, and then the waste is just left on the roadsides, and this is actually a very valuable material that can be used for heating and is often used for heating. And then a lovely picture we took last year in Valgamaa in Helme, which is a medieval wall, and this is how it's been repaired. And if this community was to try and get money or financial resources from the central government, it would probably take who knows how long. Maybe it would take some of those stones would be on the ground by that time. But this is a very immediate reaction, and this is almost like an architecture or a diagram. So I found it very valuable. And so this is something that me and Roland, we continued doing after my graduation, and this was the fascination that we now just continued having, and we produced a series of images, of collages that are kind of saturations of those situations, 6 situations that we found from the Estonian countryside. So for instance, other informal qualities would be how the ruins, as they're not directly dangerous for people, they often get habited in weird ways or unexpected informal ways, or how the Manor House Park, which is literally a ruin of a park, is something that you can easily find on the Estonian countryside, which is actually a very diverse natural environment, because it's something that was planted during the mostly 19th and 18th century with plenty of different plants. And sometimes the environment or the diversity of this environment exceeds the diversity of the forest that we have. And then this piece was exhibited, or is still exhibited, on the Venice Biennale in the Baltic Pavilion this year. So we put up this kind of an altarpiece for those informal qualities. And that's there now until November. But going a bit back to the project, so what you can see here is a building, or a ruin of a building that I found from Toro, from South Estonia, and it's actually a very famous building for the Estonian architects. It was designed by a famous Estonian architect called Toomas Rein, and it was completed in 1977. And it's a structure quite typical to the Soviet times. So it's an administrative center for a collective farm. The architecture of it is just fascinating, and actually a lot of those centers are very fascinating in their architecture. The issue is that a lot of them are placed on the countryside, and as the collective farm system does not exist anymore, they've lost their importance, and with the dwindling population of the countryside, there's not enough people to really inhabit them in any way. So here you have an interior view of the current situation. It's a beautiful building. You can see that there's a certain type of use for it at this moment. It's clearly not completely abandoned. It's just abandoned by the use of what it was supposed to have. Another interior view of the boiler house. So the scale, or this type of architecture, I find we see increasingly little, or it's just very absolute in a way and very organic. So the space I found very exciting from early on, and maybe I was stupid enough to think that I can do something with it. And I remember one of my teachers telling me, okay, great, so you have this beautiful space. What do you think that you could still do to improve it? But then it was already chosen, and there was no way back, and maybe that was a good thing, which will be yours to decide. So here's another interior picture, and you can see how the informal use has really taken over. So there's those logs which have been brought in by probably the youngsters of the surrounding villages, who are now using this place as a kind of an assembly place for their parties and whatnot when the weather doesn't permit them to be outside. So my decision was to get to know the building by cleaning it. Initially, I thought that this would mean that I will just need to spend time in it, and that's how I will learn to know it, because it's quite complex in its architecture, and it was quite hard to read, or it's impossible to read the whole building from the plan. The plan says little, every section, every cut through is different. So I thought that if I will have a reason to spend time in it, I will also get to know the architecture of it, which I think was true, but then the cleaning also meant much more than I would have anticipated in the beginning. It also just taught me how there's a certain value in the condition that the building is in right now. In a way, there must be, because there's the youngsters who like to go there, and there was some excitement in there, and there was also excitement in how you can see the nature taking over, and how you can see the weather conditions having impact on the floors, the ceilings, and so on. And understandably, there's a very thin border between a building becoming dangerous because of, as a structure, becoming dangerous to people, for people to enter, but then there's also a certain charm to it. So in the end, it meant much more than I would have thought, and actually this, the most, let's say, the most characteristic bit of this ruin, what used to be the assembly hall and the grill bar, I did choose to keep as a future potential, or just as a current potential as it is now. So this will be a view through this existing ruin towards an entrance to a building that I will explain in a following slides. So back again to the context, you can see what's going on around here. It's all mostly big scale fields or architecture. This used to be the collective farm center, so also the larger fields were around it. And then that bigger pink dot or area there is the building. And this was located on the verge of the Manor House Park. The Manor House itself is not there anymore. And so my idea was to try and approach all the layers that I had found from the countryside and from the landscapes. And I thought that it'd be appropriate to try and give it kind of a productive function, so that it would also have an impact on the landscapes that it has around it, but also could be a source of new jobs, and also just a local resource, or more like use the local resources that are there already. So I was considering a couple of, or actually all of them would be possible within the structure that I designed then. So this is a plan that kind of that kind of tries to see the use of the structure with the use of with it being used by a distillery. So what you can see on this side is pretty much the architecture of Toomas Rein in its current state. There's a lightweight structure that goes through the building that kind of follows the logic of a productive process. So it's linear enough to just go through the building. The upper side is all open to storage and yards to accommodate the processes that are needed for within this industrial process. Whereas then the manor house side is kind of left open and is more prone to be open for potential visitors or locals. So this is what was left of, or what remains of the currently existing structure. The building is 70 or a bit more than 70 meters wide, and it has those very particular long beams that go all through the building. And when I was thinking about the question of what should be kept and if anything should be kept more symbolically, then maybe symbolic is not the most appropriate thing for a space that wants to be productive. But then it did work out with the beams because they're on the ceiling and they wouldn't really be on the way. So to keep the character of the building as this long linear structure, I kind of played with the idea of keeping the old beams. So this would be the proposed section, longitudinal section, where you can see the part that just stays the same pretty much. And the new productive structure, which is importantly, there needs to be a new structure now that keeps the beams up but doesn't interrupt the productive process. And then what used to be the boiler house has become a small-scale office. I will talk about the timber roof structure in a bit. So this would be a view to the interior of the production space. So what you can see here is the existing concrete beams stripped of their gypsum that they were covered in and other seating materials, and then an introduction of a new structure of new beams, not dissimilar in their character, that will keep up those beams, but that don't try to hide or hide themselves, but more like introduce quite boldly a new layer. And in between those columns and beams, there would be an infill layer of silicate bricks, a material that's also there at the moment and used widely within that building. So I was playing around with the idea of making it quite easily buildable there, because there's not many people, there's not that many construction workers that could put up with complicated architectural design. So my idea was to kind of introduce this new supporting structure as a precast concrete structure. So these would be elements that would be brought in. And then the infill of the silicate brick would be something that could quite sloppily be, or sloppily if that was the case, put in or laid in situ, so on location. And to do that, to make it more kind of doable, there were details that I tried to introduce to that concrete structure to make the laying of the bricks further more easier. So they're small. You can't really see them, unfortunately, but they're small, dents in the concrete structure to ease the joint between the brick and the concrete. And then so the shed was actually a typology throughout the whole process. So also in terms of trying to think what the whole structure could be, the shed was a huge inspiration, because it's something that's there all over the countryside, and it's and it's so ambiguous in its use. It's something that people use for sometimes socializing and other times as actually working or for storing things and so on. And what I find particularly valuable in them is that there's always a certain specificity to the way that they're treated. So in the middle one, you can see that this shed is mostly used for storing timber, and therefore it has a permeable wall. Whereas the one there on the right is used for storing gardening equipment, including lawnmowers and things that need a concrete floor and need to be locked up from
from others. So there's always this, there's a specificity to them, but then also they're not built to last forever. So I find that quite valuable. And so the idea for the whole, for the skin of that building is to introduce a fairly simple timber structure, a timber module actually, that could act as a Schutzbau, so as a protective building to protect the valuable ruin inside, and also not interrupt with the structure of it too much, so that maybe in 50 or less years, what actually remains is the structure within, and the shed that was initially built to protect it could also just disappear. But also then that timber structure could work as sometimes being insulated and other times just being open and permeable for air and whatnot to come in, to just kind of protect the productive yards, but not really keep to not insulate them. So that's the module, and in the detail you can see how sometimes there's a layer of insulation in between, and then other times it's just a double layer of timber that's permeable. And that's an interior, a view from the interior towards the outside through a storage yard that is permeable. And so that leads those productive yards to be spaces that can be more easily used during summer when the weather is good, and the whole interior space can open up to them, and these can be taken into use. Whereas in the winter condition, the interior can be sealed off and only a smaller amount of the space is insulated. And everything kind of condenses to the inside. So the meeting of the timber and the concrete structure, I always try to keep simple enough to in the end just kind of encourage this idea of the skin maybe, or the ruin outlasting its skin. So what is supposed to be protective maybe becomes more vulnerable over time. The precast columns introduced in the proposed design, they too are not attached to the existing columns. They're just put underneath to support it. So they don't need any joints or any particular joints. And this is an image of what could happen or what may happen within years. We don't really know what's going on this picture, really. We don't know if it's being rebuilt or if it's being demolished. But what's still there is the concrete, and what's being, or what is going is the skin. So just maybe as an end note, that was another layer of design or designing that I did and very much enjoyed during this project. So to really work through the interiors and the feeding of the interiors, I was working with 1 to 20 models, or more like photographic scenes, to just really kind of try and test out the materials and test out the feeding, what these spaces may have. So the pictures are taken from these models that I made. And there's some more process photos so you can get the scale. So using 2 types of concrete, as I think will be a good way to deal with the existing building. This is how the photos will be taken.
and that's a lucky graduate with the models. So, thanks. That's it.
So thank you, Laura, so much for this great presentation. So now the question time. I have the first question myself, so please prepare. While following your presentation, I had the strong feeling that you was approaching to the building just to the physical body. Was it like a statement, or was it also in your mind sometimes about something about the memory of the building? When was it built? How was it used? And who are the possible users in the future?
I think that in terms of the memory, it was a lot easier for me to approach it as a stranger, as I was working from a foreign context. And I think a question as this would easily come up if I was working in Estonian, especially with my teachers being of the generation of my parents. And here, this building has a very strong connotation to a regime that's now gone, whereas my teachers there didn't really have that connotation. So I think, in a way, I'm not saying that it's necessarily good to distance myself from it, but that's what happened this time. So I didn't really question it always. I did, of course, question how it would be used now. So also, therefore, I was quite interested in when I went there and when I saw that, in fact, it is in use now. There are people using it and going there and actually being very afraid when we first got there and started taking pictures, because I think they kind of, it's theirs now and we were the intruders. So I think that was one of the reasons why I tried to keep some of the spaces more ambiguous. And I know my tutor, Mark Pimlett, told me that, of course, these spaces will have to be sealed off if they're going to be in use, because obviously there would be homeless people who would be going in there. But in fact, when we think about Estonia, there's like this certain peripherality here, where there's not that many homeless people there. It's not an urban context. It's a radically rural context. So I think there's a way to deal with some of those spaces, particularly to that rural context.